From the initial settlement of America, the main role of women had been to carry out domestic chores. They cooked, cleaned, and raised their children. As the first wave of feminism came about, and tensions between the northern and southern sections of the United States increased, the American Civil War broke out. This event would change the role of women. During the Civil War, women began to take on more than they had ever previously been able to accomplish. Many were forced to send their loved ones off to war, while they took on the traditionally masculine roles that were left behind. This allowed for an expansion upon what it truly meant to be a woman. These female individuals proved that they could get along just fine without men that had become soldiers. The Civil War became an incredibly violent and damaging event. Soldiers were faced with unthinkable conditions, families were split apart and forced to face each other on the battlefield. In a letter from Sue Carter to her cousin Mary, she writes,
"Tell dear aunt not to be unhappy because cousins Will and Tom are in opposite parties. Tell her, cousin Molly, that I would try to console her, but I know not how."
Aside from the brutality of the conflict, the soldiers also faced extremely unsanitary conditions in camps and hospitals. The situation was far less than ideal for those involved. Although women were unable to enlist as soldiers, many yearned to serve their country in any way possible. In order to do so, some women disguised themselves as young men so that they could serve within the ranks. It has been suggested that as many as 400 northern women disguised themselves as men and became soldiers. During the time of the Civil War, gender was reinforced in particularly stereotypical ways. Blanton and Cook write, "Indeed, in the 1860s, clothing was the most potent public indication of gender. This means that people rarely knew what a woman would look like in pants, making it easier for women to dress as soldiers to pass as male. Women's physical features could also help them to pass as the opposite gender, typically having softer features. They were oftentimes mistaken for young boys who were not quite at the Army's age requirement of 18. For example, an unidentified drummer boy who was wounded at Gettysburg was not the lad of 15 he appeared to be, but a girl of 18 who refused to give her real name or any other personal information. These female soldiers would attempt to keep their true identities hidden. Sometimes they established friendships with male soldiers or other disguised women who would help them to maintain their cover. The open setting of army encampments further allowed for the privacy of women soldiers and allowed them to stay under the radar. Tent cities or temporary winter quarters out of doors contributed to women soldiers' ability to avoid detection, while they attended to the necessary sanitary matters of menstruation, urination, and bowel movements. Aside from simply passing as male, these female soldiers had to perform all the regular duties of members of the army. Just like their male compatriots, women had to learn how to be soldiers. They were required to train and fight like any of their comrades. Luckily, they were already exposed to hard work prior to their enlistment in the army. Women were faced with difficult work in manual labor in daily life, which made an easy transition to the amount of labor required by their positions in the army. These women were incredibly dedicated to their positions. Only 3 women soldiers were known to have deserted their regiments, and 2 of these later re-enlisted. Women served in all aspects of the army: infantry, cavalry, and artillery. More commonly, they provided medical care to the members of these armed forces. Prior to the Civil War, nursing was not an actual occupation. The premise of nursing began in the home. It was traditional for the women of the household to take care of their family's members when sick or injured. The advent of the U.S. Civil War, however, created another environment for caregiving. Women left their households, forsaking their families and personal needs as they volunteered to care for young soldiers. These women volunteered many hours and worked to found small hospitals for the soldiers who were wounded in the war. During the war, there was a lack of hospitals, nurses, and medical supplies. The medical corps said they did the best they could with what they had available. The amount of casualties soared as the conflict became incredibly brutal. The medical technique of amputation had a large impact on the climbing mortality rate. It was used quite often as gunshot wounds would shatter bones beyond repair. High thigh or hip amputations resulted in a mortality rate of 83%, usually from massive blood loss and infection. Military hospitals during the Civil War had little access to trained physicians. Victoria Holder writes that each regiment had one surgeon and 2 assistant surgeons. These men and a few women, such as Mary Edwards Walker, M.D., the first American woman physician, received little training compared to the other European counterparts. American doctors received only 2 years of instruction, and some didn't even attend formal schooling. Instead, they purchased their degrees from diploma mills. Oftentimes, the medical techniques of the Civil War era are criticized. The surgeons are labeled butchers because of their large amount of amputations that were carried out. However, the doctors and nurses did the best they could with overwhelming casualties, poor conditions, and lack of supplies and medicine. Whether they were actually involved in the war effort or left on the home front, women's role during the Civil War was incredibly important. The era became a time of transformation for American women. They were forced to take on the tasks that had previously belonged to the men that were sent to war. In both the North and the South, women gathered in aid societies, circulated petitions, and at home, took over the masculine duties of running the household. The American women's role of a mother was of particular importance during this time. Women had to go through the horrible experience of sending loved ones to war, and many times they were unable to assist these men in any way, yet they still encouraged their enlistment. Women showed their patriotism through the support of their loved ones and family members. They sent these men to war with great pride in their country. Along with mothers, younger women too were important in encouraging men's patriotism, although their role was often imagined as more stringent than nurturing. These young ladies helped to motivate soldiers by labeling them as cowards and considering them less attractive if they did not choose to serve in their country. It became incredibly difficult for family members to stay in contact with those who had enlisted. Sue Carter writes in a letter, I know where Will is
and can hear from him sometime. But where is Cousin Tom? Oh, how unhappy I have been about him since I received his last letter, which was in May. If I could feel sure of his safety, I would be so happy.
Aside from nearly losing contact with loved ones, women on the home front had to deal with the death of those soldiers. Harriet McElhenney serves as an example of this. During the war, she received a letter from Francis Pleasance, a man that had known her husband. The letter retold the specifics of her husband's injury, saying,
The wound was a severe one, it being near the left thigh, and discharged a great deal of matter all the time.
Pleasance elaborated on the topic, stating how difficult it was for him to make Harriet's husband aware that he was dying.
I do not think he was conscious of his situation, as he kept telling us that he was better all the time. I did not think it was best to tell him of his situation, as we expected you every hour and wanted you to be the one, as I assure you it is a very painful thing to tell an entire stranger that he is dying.
Imagine the pain and guilt Harriet must have dealt with because she was unable to be with her husband in his dying days. Within her diary entries, Nancy Emerson also discusses the suffering that wives and children would go through after hearing news of the death of male family members who were serving in the Army. She wrote,
Colonel William Baylor was killed, leaving a heartbroken wife and mother and sister to mourn his loss, but they have hope in his death. James Gabbert was also killed at this battle. His brother John was wounded before, but died after, and was brought home to be buried.
This weighed quite heavily on the women of the Civil War. To get through these difficult times, women of the era relied heavily on religion. Foss writes, as the home became increasingly associated with grief, loss, and the absence of men, several authors offered new religious versions of home that abandoned the project of domesticity in this world, but promised the comforts of home in the next. Religion is referred to in the diaries and letters of many women as well. For example, Sue Carter writes,
I cannot but feel that it is the Lord's will that our once prosperous and happy nation must be divided.
Religion helped these women to cope with unfortunate circumstances. This emotional trauma faced by women during times of war is often overlooked. In reality, it is very serious and even comparable to the experiences of soldiers. War killed and wounded women on the home front, says Foz, even if the injuries were invisible or the causes of death misunderstood. Another role women took on during the Civil War involved paid occupations. The men that enlisted in the army had left positions empty. Historian Niani Melagoda writes that government clerical jobs were open to women as a result of the Civil War. Southern women took up positions in the Confederate Post Office, Quartermaster's Department, and Treasury Departments. The Confederate Treasury Department provided women with the opportunity of paid work. With few men available, government officials turned to women to fill positions. Apart from government positions, school teachers of the era were most commonly women. In a letter, Lizzie Fackler writes about a female teacher in her town.
Mrs. Forrest has the best school in town now, and I walk there about a mile every morning to take French lessons.
These jobs became a new experience for women whose traditional role took place predominantly within the household. Throughout the war, women at home maintained a large amount of knowledge of the conflict. In her diary, Mary Chestnut exemplifies enthusiastic opinions about the war and military tactics. She says, "We have to meet tremendous odds
by pluck, activity, zeal, dash, endurance of the toughest military instinct. We have had to choose born leaders of men who could attract love and secure trust."
In a letter, Lizzie Fackler expresses her fear of the Union troops that are approaching her town.
We have been several times alarmed, for fear the Yankees would get us. But they have not succeeded yet, and I trust that Jackson will never give us up to them. They have been as near as 18 miles in several directions.
These women also were responsible for defending their families against soldiers camped in their towns. Some befriended the soldiers. Lizzie Fackler writes of meeting some enlisted men in the town and having quite a good time with them. However, according to Niani Melagoda, there were many challenges the white Southern women had to face during the Civil War apart from securing food and protecting their young children. They also had to safeguard themselves from the occupying military forces. There were many stories of robbery, insults, and worse crimes such as rape. Prior to the Civil War, women maintained a traditional role of caring for children and attending to household chores. This function had been the norm since the settlement of the Americas. The conflict between the northern and southern states provided an opportunity for women of the time to advance past their stereotypical role in society. The wartime era allowed women to fight as men, become doctors, take paid occupations, and hold down fort on the home front. At this same time, women were becoming more educated, fighting for the liberation of slaves and eventually of themselves.